What is good people? I hope you're all safe and well. In today's episode, I want to do things a little differently to the usual format of the show. This story is a work of fiction that is based on real historical events. I've written this story to bring forth a potential perspective of a Sikh World War I veteran. Any similarity to real people or existing narratives is a complete coincidence, but that would kind of prove my point, to be honest. With that said, let's get on with it. It is a cold November morning, and despite all the noise, the veteran sits unmoving with his eyes fixated on the crackling fire as it lends its warmth to everyone in the room. Watching the flames envelop themselves around the wood, casting embers into the open, he is then awoken from his trance by the interviewer, asking him if he is ready and whether they can do anything to make him more comfortable for the coming exchange. Realizing that everyone is now looking at him, he smiles politely at her and declines, stating that he is ready to regale everyone with stories of his youth. These were tales of a time when foreign powers occupied the land he once called home, a land that has since been split into two by a border that now prevents him from living in his ancestral town. A time where scores of people like him were recruited into fighting a war that many of them did not understand. When teachers left their classrooms, farmers left their fields to be tilled by others. A time when the writer's pen was replaced by the soldier's rifle, and millions of people would go to distant lands to wage war, many of whom would never return home. He starts to tell of the day that he first shipped out, the painful goodbye he bid his mother and father, who himself had worn the same uniform in battles that had now since passed from living memory. He goes on to describe the cacophony of emotions that were filling his mind, recalling tales of great battles fought by heroes of centuries past, stories of valor, glory, and sacrifice in struggles for justice, peace, and freedom. He continues that he never would have guessed that he too would be faced with those same notions of gaining honor and valor, of maybe one day being one of those stories for the generations that are yet to come. The interviewer then asks what he remembers of the battles that he took part in, and for a moment he looks back towards the fire and is transported back to the trench that he had called home for so long. The room melts away as he narrates the sound of the whistles being blown as they prepared to go over the top for yet another attempt at gaining ground from the enemy forces that were entrenched a mere 50 yards away. As he braced himself for yet another meeting with death, the order was given, and he, along with his comrades, climbed out of the shelter of the trench and ran straight into the blasts of fire, metal, and lead coming from their objective. As his vision blurred from the smoke and dirt kicked up by the artillery, he could see silhouettes of many of his friends falling wounded or dead. Never had 50 yards been so far. Whether by divine intervention or just sheer luck, he made it to the opposition's location, in which a desperate melee was fought between the attacking force and the defenders. He loses his grasp on the memory as it fades away, almost as if it was a half-remembered dream. Returning to the room, he relays to the interviewer that at that point of the war, the enticement of the glory of battle had faded, leaving nothing but mud and blood. People who had once laughed and joked with each other now lay eternally silent in no man's land. He is then prompted by the interviewer to recount the worst experience he had in that period of his life. Without pause, he instantly starts to describe the day. It was sunny in the height of spring while he and his friends were sat in a field laughing while reminiscing their youth. For an instant, he had forgotten all about the war. Then, over the laughter, the sound of whistles pierced the air. Immediately after, a bullet flies directly into his friend, who stood performing a story. In an instant, the field is filled with the sounds of rifles. The soldier, trying his best to find cover from the hail of fire and metal, suddenly felt the wind get knocked out of him, which was followed by a wave of burning pain. realized he had been shot in the stomach and immediately fell to the ground while trying to staunch the flow of blood that was staining the dirt beneath him. Just before blacking out, he glanced about and through blurred vision, helplessly watched as people around him fell still. He came to a few days later in the hospital and was told about which of his friends had been killed in the ambush. As the memory fades back into the recesses of his mind, he is asked by the interviewer which battle was this, and for a moment he gazes at the interviewer with a puzzled expression. After a few seconds, he responds, "That was the Jallianwala Bagh massacre." Jallianwala Bagh is a garden located near Harmandir Sahib in the city of Amritsar. The massacre took place a mere 5 months after the end of World War I, on the 13th of April 1919, which was Vaisakhi, a festival of both religious and cultural significance. In the lead up to the massacre, tensions were high in the region, with increased agitation against the British Raj. Growing dissent was a result of the Rowlatt Act, which allowed the state to prosecute political cases without juries and permitted the internment of suspects without trial. It was proclaimed that crowds of more than 4 people in the city had been banned. However, this notice was not well disseminated through the area. As such, the crowd made up of those celebrating the festival and those peacefully protesting the deportation of 2 nationalist leaders were all seen as dissenters by the officers in charge. Reginald Dyer, the main perpetrator of the massacre, made no attempts to peaceably disperse the crowds in the enclosed Bagh, and the main exits were blocked by troops in armoured vehicles that were armed with machine guns. In his words, this was not to disperse the crowds, but to punish the Indians for disobedience. When the order was given, the troops were forced to fire into the densest parts of the crowd with the aim of inflicting the maximum number of casualties. Firing continued for around 10 minutes, with a ceasefire only being given as ammunition were nearly exhausted. 1,650 rounds were reportedly fired into a crowd that is estimated to have been between 10 and 20,000 people. At least 379 people were killed, however other estimates put the number closer to 1,500 casualties, with approximately 1,000 people killed. The deaths and casualties were not only the result of the bullets being fired at them, but also the stampedes and the crushing of crowds trying to flee via a singular narrow gate, as all the other entrances had been blocked. The British government tried to suppress information of the massacre, and it was initially reported as a violent clash between rebels and authorities. Dyer was not court-martialed or treated as a murderer, as he was deemed to have been acting upon military orders, as is often the way with imperial powers of Europe. The pain this act of terror caused kindled the fires of revolution that followed, with many taking up the cause of independence from the British. A significant revolutionary known as Arjun Singh survived the massacre and then tracked down and killed Odwaya, who was the colonial overseer of Punjab at the time of the massacre. Many condemned this act, including the man who would go on to be India's first Prime Minister. He would later recant this condemnation and hail Arjun Singh as a hero of the independence movement. The purpose of adopting the narrative of a World War I veteran was to scratch the surface of a wider discourse that must be had about the ways these colonial powers oppressed the peoples they lorded over. People who would go kill and bleed in what can only be described as an imperial slaughter would then themselves continue to face oppression from the empires they had fought for. This is a conversation that is relevant the world over, from Jallianwala Bagh to the Kikuyu districts to Oak Creek. And these systems of oppression, they exist and operate to this day. They use the same names and they use the same flags. It's time we stop perpetuating the truth of liars. It's time we topple the systems that continue to oppress. It's time we stop venerating institutions that perpetrate evil and call it progress. The empire must fall.